As more and more begin to know, the status quo has got to go. They're bound to say yes to a man named Dr. No, a man who makes the establishment panic. Grassroots are growing way too wild, too organic.
So a Hamas delegation arrived in Cairo on Sunday for hostage deal talks, but Israel has boycotted the negotiations. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu broke off hostage deal talks because Hamas did not provide a list of all the living Israeli hostages. So Kyle Anzelin actually wrote this part up on Friday, that Netanyahu told Qatar and Egypt, and they're mediating the talks between Israel and Hamas. He told them that there will be no more, Israel will not participate in the talks anymore until Hamas provides a full list of living Israeli hostages in Gaza. And what was interesting is that Haaretz reported on Sunday that they cited sources in the Israeli security cabinet who criticized Netanyahu for making that demand, pretty much saying that it was not a necessary demand, kind of hinting that it was just made to sabotage the negotiations. One of those sources said, quote, "As with the previous deal, one could assume there would eventually be proper lists of the hostages and of those no longer living. This didn't need to be made into a deal breaker for advancing the negotiations," end quote. So the potential deal that's on the table is for Hamas to release about 40 Israeli hostages in exchange for a 6-week ceasefire and the release of hundreds of Palestinian prisoners. Hamas has been seeking a permanent ceasefire and Israeli withdrawal from Gaza, but there were signs on Sunday that the Palestinian group may be more flexible on its demands. So a senior Hamas source told Al Mayadeen, which is a Lebanese-based outlet, their editorial line is very anti-Israel, and one of their Hamas sources said that they think a deal could be reached soon, despite obstacles being put in the way by Israel. The source said, quote, "Despite these obstacles, the possibility of reaching an agreement is still viable, especially as the occupation is being dealt heavy blows in Khan Yunis and Al Zaytun neighborhood," end quote. And I guess the Hamas officials talking about the fighting on the ground there. So citing Arab media, Haaretz also said that a Hamas source said the group could be flexible on the length of the ceasefire and the number of Palestinian prisoners that will be released. But both Hamas sources said that they are standing firm on 2 conditions, which is Israel allowing displaced Palestinians to return to northern Gaza and the delivery of much more aid into the north, where people are really starving. The Ruby Mar, which is a British-owned cargo ship that was hit by a Houthi missile on February 18th, has officially sank. And this was announced by the U.S. military on Saturday. They put a picture out of the ship going under the water. And so this is the first ship that's lost in this Houthi campaign in the Red Sea, in the Gulf of Aden, where they've been attacking ships. So a British cargo ship has sank, and you know, in response to the news, the Houthis have vowed that they will sink more British ships. So Hussein El-Ezi, the Houthis' deputy foreign minister, said, quote, "Yemen will continue to sink more British ships, and any repercussions or other damages will be added to Britain's bill, as it is a rogue state that attacks Yemen and partners with America in sponsoring the ongoing crime against civilians in Gaza," end quote. So this is just an example of how much things have just become a mess since the U.S. and the U.K. started bombing the Houthis on January 12th. That's when the Houthis started targeting American and British commercial shipping. And it just continues to escalate, and they're not showing any sign of backing down. And I also mentioned on February 29th and March 1st, which was last Thursday and Friday, the U.S. reported that it launched more missile strikes in Houthi-controlled Yemen. They're continuing, they keep bombing Yemen, and it's just not doing anything. So this is interesting. There was a new poll from Reuters Ipsos last week that found the majority of Democratic voters prefer a presidential candidate who doesn't support military aid to Israel. Another sign that President Biden's unconditional support for the Israeli slaughter of Palestinians in Gaza could cost him in November. The poll shows that 56% of respondents who identified as Democrats were less likely to support a candidate who backs military aid, while 40% were more likely to support such a candidate. The results were more evenly split across the board, taking into account Democrats, Republicans, and independents. It found 40% of American voters, of all voters, would be less likely to support a pro-Israel military aid candidate, while 47% were more likely to support such candidate. And Republicans, the majority of them favor a candidate who wants to give military aid to Israel. 62% said that they do favor a pro-Israel candidate, and 34% said they would be less likely to support a candidate like that. So President Biden, of course, is expected to run against Trump. That seems to be inevitable if Biden can make it till November. And both of them are staunch Israel supporters. Obviously, we all know Biden is because of everything he's been doing. But Trump, was before Biden. He gave Israel everything that they wanted. Moving the embassy to Jerusalem, the policy on settlements in the West Bank, recognizing the annexation of Golan Heights, many things like that. So, there's no reason to think that Trump is going to be any better than Biden here. And Biden is facing a wave of criticism and protest from within the Democratic Party over his unconditional support for the Israeli massacre in Gaza. This is another one from Kyle. This one's at the Libertarian Institute. Zelensky criticized his Western supporters for not providing enough aid. He said? I'll just read his quote here. He said, quote, "When lives are lost and partners are simply playing internal political games or disputes that limit our defense, it's impossible to understand. It's unacceptable, and it will be impossible to forget. The world will remember this," end quote. So, of course, he's not happy with the U.S. that he hasn't gotten the $61 billion in new aid that Biden wants Congress to pass to fuel this war for another year.
Act worthy of yourselves. That was the message from Dr. Joseph Warren, one of the great heroes of the American Revolutionary War. That's what he urged the people to do when remembering the massacre in Boston, which was tomorrow in history, March 5th, 1770. And this was, if you're not familiar already, this was one of the most significant events that turned colonial sentiment against the British more generally, and also cemented their opposition to standing armies particularly. Here's how Warren described things that they were facing in 1775. He painted a picture of what they once again faced some years later. He said, "Our streets are again filled with armed men. Our harbor is crowded with ships of war, but these cannot intimidate us. Our liberty must be preserved. It is far dearer than life." This is the great patriot again, Joseph Warren, Revolutionary War hero, who's telling us, like, liberty or death, really, is what he's saying here. And he goes on, he says, "We hold it even dear as our allegiance. We must defend it against the attacks of friends as well as enemies. Liberty is the primary object. Liberty is the goal, and our allegiance to no nation on earth should supplant our love of liberty," is really what he's getting to. And he's even saying we cannot even suffer the Britons to ravish it from us. And this was a speech given on what they used to call Massacre Day. They didn't call it the Boston Massacre. They referred to it as Massacre Day, and it was so important in the Boston area during the American Revolution, that is the run-up to the War for Independence, that it was commemorated as kind of a solemn public holiday in the area with speeches from prominent patriots. But let's get to some highlights from Dr. Joseph Warren's second Massacre Day oration, or second speech, keynote speech, the only person to ever deliver it twice. This was on March 6th, 1775. The 5th was a Sunday that year, so they did not do this type of thing on Sundays, so they held the event the following day on Monday. Of course, as he did in the 1772 speech, he really kicks it off with a natural rights view. This was the view, our rights come from our Creator, we do not get our rights as a gift from government, and he opened with that. Voluntary association and natural rights. Pretty fascinating stuff and pretty hardcore, especially for the time. That personal freedom, he said, is the natural right of every man, and that property, or an exclusive right to dispose of what he has honestly acquired by his own labor, necessarily arises therefrom, are truths which common sense has placed beyond the reach of contradiction. Again, so this is a very important truth for today, but the population at large is so far from this type of perspective, that our rights come from our Creator, that natural rights and personal freedom, this is what our birthright, and we also have exclusive property rights in what we earn. So this is not a mentality that a vast majority of people have today, but this was widely accepted by many people in Boston, at least at the time, Virginia as well. And he said, "And no man or body of men can, without being guilty of flagrant injustice, claim a right to dispose of the persons or acquisitions of any other man or body of men, unless it can be proved that such a right has arisen from some compact between the parties in which it has been explicitly and freely granted." Halfway there. I mean, he's getting there. It's a really interesting approach. And then he went into kind of because he's talking about how the only way you can claim this type of power is if you have proof that we've agreed to it. And he then goes through some history of the early settlement there in Boston and Massachusetts, which was intended, Aaron writes, to determine with what, this is how Warren put it, determine with what degree of justice the late Parliament of Great Britain has assumed the power of giving away that property which the Americans have earned by their labor. So by working with the soil, by working in shops, by creating and building things, what they earned was their own, and Parliament had no right to take even a portion of it. He said, when the measures of administration had disgusted the colonies to the highest degree, and the people of Great Britain had, by artifice and falsehood, been irritated against America, an army was sent over to enforce submission to certain acts of the British Parliament, which reason scored to countenance, and which placemen and pensioners were found unable to support. So people who didn't have much money either were also getting pretty screwed over. And then, of course, what did the British do? They sent armies to enforce their will. They thought the people were too uppity and they had to be put down. And this is where they were finding themselves once again in 1775. He said, martial law and the government of a well-regulated city are so entirely different that it has always, this was not considered a new thing. This was from a long understanding in both American and British history, and I've covered this in other episodes. I should have had this one handy, but this was a widely understood maxim that standing armies were always dangerous. And here was a man a man willing to fight, unlike most anyone alive today. We'll get to that near the end of the show. Martial law and the government of a well-regulated city are so entirely different that it has always been considered as improper to quarter troops in populous cities. Frequent disputes must necessarily arise between the citizen and the soldier, even if no previous animosities subsist. And he said, and it is further certain from a consideration of the nature of mankind, as well as from constant experience, that standing armies always endanger the liberty of the subject. It's not sometimes, it's not once in a while, it's not only in emergencies or extreme cases, it's not just over there, it's not just dictators, it's literally in every situation. Here's the war hero telling us that standing armies always endanger the liberty of the subject.
The Supreme Court ruling, a unanimous ruling that states cannot remove presidential candidates from the ballot. Jim, have you seen it, and what are your thoughts on it?
I have seen it. I haven't had a chance to digest it in detail, but read through it quickly. I think this was expected. I think it's good that it was unanimous. I've been saying all along that Plan A for November was to keep Trump off the ballot. I think there's still a little wiggle room with regard to maybe a state conviction, but I think that wiggle room for the states that want to keep him off the ballot is pretty narrow at this point. So at this point, I think they've got to resort to Plan B, which is to go back to the kind of shenanigans we saw in 2020. But right now, yeah, I think for what is left of an American constitutional system, this is a very significant development.
It seems like they're getting backed in a corner now. Everything they try to throw at Trump, and neither of us are Trump fans necessarily. We love the fact that he has the best enemies, being the worst people. But everything they try to throw at him is not sticking. Obviously, it's rebounding, it's ricocheting. But you're right, I think, Jim, that the fact that this was a unanimous decision takes a lot of the wind out of their sails.
It does. And look, I supported Trump in 2016. I'm supporting him this year. I don't have any illusions about him. There's a lot about him I like. There's some things I don't like. I especially, as you say, dislike the people who hate him. So that's worth something. And I think one thing he says that's true is that when he says to his adoring fans that it's not so much me that they hate, it's you that they hate. That's absolutely true. I mean, there are just a lot of lumpen Americanos out there in flyover country who idolize him, and for the same reason they idolize him as the orange savior, his detractors hate him as the orange Hitler because of the kind of people who like him. And unfortunately, I don't think that even if he does win, I think the odds of that are actually rather small, but even if he does win, I don't think he'll be any more successful in changing the course of what is an increasingly dysfunctional remnant or vestige of a constitutional system.
Says, just to round up, French president warns of EU ground intervention in Ukraine. British Prime Minister confirms UK military personnel on the ground in Ukraine. German Air Force chief says U.S. military personnel are on the ground in Ukraine assisting with missile launches. So to me, Jim, it sounds like we are moving closer to that area where some foul up could end up in a disaster.
Exactly right. And, I don't know Mike Tracy only slightly, but I respect a lot of the work he does. And I think that he's very pithy the way he put that together. And again, well, we're just sending a few advisors to Vietnam. What could possibly go wrong? I mean, and here, except it's a nuclear armed state, and one that is right on its front doorstep here. I mean, there's no way these people can prevail. Now, there's some people who think now that what really they're shooting for is some kind of a frozen conflict, one where the Russians can be tied down and bled white for years on end, no matter if there's a single Ukrainian left or if there's any European economy left. I don't know what they think they're doing, but like we were saying earlier with Trump, he can't admit where he was wrong, and these people can't admit where they were wrong. Yeah. They cannot find some way to climb off of the out of the tree that they've gotten themselves pushed up into. And I just don't know where this goes unless at some point the Russians decide simply, look, the comedy must end. We must put an end to this militarily. And if the other side does something stupid, well, then they do. But they've got to roll those dice. If I were in their shoes.
Yeah, I mean, let's not forget, these people have dedicated their entire careers to taking out Russia. People like Newland and Blinken and
Sure.
Sullivan and the others. Well, let's move on to our last topic, because I just wanted to talk to you about this, because I find it fascinating, which is what's happening with Gaza and Israel right now. And all of our viewers hopefully they go beyond the mainstream. We know that there have been, and even Austin, Secretary of Defense, said before Congress, 25,000 civilians have been killed in Gaza by the Israeli military. There was a horrific scene last week where a bunch of Palestinians were rushing to an aid truck to get some food because they're starving, and they were mowed down by the Israelis. Horrific scenes. We know for a fact, obviously, that we give a lot of money to Israel and we give a lot of weapons, and that's why a lot of the reason we're talking about it. But Jim, here is a situation. The Biden administration seems to be so paralyzed by what's happening there. The world is disgusted and outraged at what's happening. And here you have the Biden administration controlling the levers, essentially, of Israel's power with our power of the purse and the power of the bombs, and incapable of doing anything as a famine threatens 2 million people. So what do the geniuses come up with? Let's drop 30,000 meals by air onto the ground to feed 2.5 million starving civilians. I was thinking of Jesus with the 5 loaves and fishes. It's not going to work. I mean, have you ever? You've been a diplomat. In diplomatic history, has there ever been a situation where a close American ally refuses to allow humanitarian aid through their territory?
I can't think of one off the top of my head. I can't say that didn't happen, but I certainly can't think of a case. And you're right, 30,000 meals, and it's not 30,000 days per person. That's one meal per day. For 30,000 people, and just a total drop in the bucket. And you do have to wonder. I've seen some reference that once these things drop in, and people start to gather this food, are the Israelis going to target them? I don't know. Yeah. I mean, it seems pretty clear that the destroy Amalek mentality is pretty strong in the Israeli government right now. Now, does that mean that they think they can still continue with this operation in Gaza and actually beat Hamas, or is it really more aimed at simply clearing the people out of there? They're going to try to push them into Egypt. How are the Egyptians going to handle that? And of course, there's more and more talk that the Israelis are going to launch an attack against Hezbollah in Lebanon. You'd think, given how much they've got their hands full in Gaza, both militarily and in terms of the black eye they're taking, in terms of the public the world perceptions of the operation, they would want to keep that northern front as quiet as possible. It doesn't seem that that's what they want, and the only reason I can think that they would want to move forward against Hezbollah is that somehow it's going to drag the United States directly into the conflict.